Hello, thank you so much for joining our live chat today with the filmmakers of Getting Back to Abnormal. I'd like to introduce all of the filmmakers. We have Louis Alvarez and Andy over here. We have Peter. You want to say hello?
Hello.
And then we have Paul. So it's a great honor to have all four filmmakers to be talking with the film and answering your questions today. And congratulations on the broadcast premiere yesterday evening on PBS. The film will also be streaming on the POV website for a limited time starting today until August 12th, 2014. So please, anybody who's watching, please submit your questions and we will answer them as much as possible. So Louis, would you mind briefly describing the film yet for anybody who hasn't seen it yet?
Sure, and thanks, Shannon. We're really enjoying the broadcast and the streaming afterlife, and it's excited to be part of POV once again. Getting Back to Abnormal is something we started about 5 years ago, and we wanted to make what we called the first post-Katrina movie, which looked at how the city was kind of, after all the news crews left after Katrina and the movie and the documentarians, what was left over and how the people were going to remake their lives and kind of try to get back to the way they were before. And what evolved was this film with a lot of different stories, a lot of different threads, tied together by us following an interesting city council race, where a kind of controversial white incumbent who was representing a majority black district was trying to win re-election. And it kind of brought up all these kinds of underlying streams of New Orleans culture, which have to do with race and class and power. And at the same time, we wanted to show that parts of New Orleans, the heart of New Orleans, kept beating. The street parades, the great food, the music, that just goes on and on. So the film is kind of, for us, kind of a tapestry about life in New Orleans today.
Fantastic. And so our first question is that we're curious, how did you all balance the filmmaking roles, working together as a team of four?
Well, we've worked together for a long time. Andy, Louis, and I have known each other for 30 years. And, we've made now 3 films together, and with Peter we've made 2 films together. So, it's kind of a long relationship. You know each other, the other's thoughts, and, we share a perspective, for the most part. We like each other. So, I mean, there's always the ups and downs of production. Probably helps a lot for the guys from New York that I live in Texas, so I'm not bothering them all the time. But I think there were very few disagreements per se. I think a lot of people try to figure out how 4 filmmakers can make something, and all the filmmakers that are out there today understand that even when they're collaborating with one person, there's a lot of dynamics to go through, and a lot of times things aren't working, and especially editors bear the brunt of that a lot of time. Peter might agree with that, but it's just, we've been working together for a long time, and for Andy, Louis, and I, we grew up as filmmakers in New Orleans, and this is something that we really wanted to do. So I think remarkably there was not, you guys can comment on this, I don't think there was a whole lot of hardness in terms of working together.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that also just it's interesting to point out that the 4 of us, make up a crew. Okay, so we didn't need to have sort of a lot of extra hands. And I do the shooting, and Peter does the editing, and both Louis and Paul do interviewing, so we sort of have roles, as it were, and we're also all directors and producers. So wherever there might be aesthetic disagreements, they sort of tended to be fairly mild. Because I think even though we started off this movie not knowing exactly who our main characters were going to be and what exactly the story was that we were trying to tell, when we encounter things that we find interesting, we all pretty much agree. And so, when we first discovered that Stacey Head was going to be our AA character, it was like, okay, yep, no doubt about it. Nope, yep. And then, in addition, when she came along with Barbara Listen Keller, it was like, Oh, yes. Okay. This, it's a twofer, by God, and of course that formed the kind of the heart of the movie, and the relationship is the heart of the movie. Although, when we started out, as I think Louis pointed out, we were trying to do a lot of different things, and we wanted to purposely create a tapestry, something that we could weave various streams together that would kind of somehow come to some better understanding of what makes New Orleans tick, what the essence of the place is, which is kind of what what we did in our earlier work too in New Orleans. So it was a sort of a coming home of sorts.
And I think unlike maybe other productions, one of the reasons we take so long too maybe is that we give everything a shot. So as the editor on this, we cut every possible thing that might be used. We don't sort of make executive decisions about this isn't going to work. We really give everything a shot, and so sometimes we're happily surprised, sometimes we're not. So we don't have that kind of because where you start to disagree is when you talk in theoreticals. Once you do something, then it's pretty obvious whether it's working or not, I think. So I think that's part of our process, and so that's why I think it's easier in terms of making decisions. Everybody wants to see something before they decide whether it's any good. So.
Yeah, we all agree when something works. I think we all sort of kind of go, yeah, that works. Yeah, we know, having had worked together for so long, we know what is ultimately going to. Now, what we don't know, of course, is how it's all going to fit together. And that's kind of the long process that I think that Peter's alluding to, where we do try everything, and then once you try individual things, how the hell are you going to weave it together and have it make some sense, especially when we were specifically trying to put disparate things together, And so when we did come upon this one story, which is a political story, but it's politics, it's metaphor, we said, okay, well, all right, this is going to form the spine of our movie, but we don't want that to cancel out all these other things. And then that was, that's why we spent a lot of time in the editing room.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about the filmmaking process, really quick? What did you first set out to make? What were your original intention for the film? Then how did that?
Three of us, as someone mentioned before, three of us had spent quite a bit of time in New Orleans, and we knew that we wanted to try to make a film. Whatever the film was going to be, was going to kind of express the perspective of New Orleanians, not folks from away who say, oh, well, this is what I see about New Orleans, and I'm going to present this to the world. It's like New Orleans do have a kind of their own way of thinking. They kind of march to a different drummer. So we knew we wanted to do a film about that, and we knew part of that was going to be about race relations, which are more complicated and both, I would say, more hopeful and also more complicated than they are in the rest of the country because of New Orleans' bizarre racial history going back hundreds of years. So that's what we knew, and we had a very deep Rolodex from having lived there and just being really part of New Orleans, kind of exiled, New Orleans in exile. So when we went down there, we called up a lot of different people from all walks of life looking for good stories. And we just happened to discover the Stacey Head was right in the middle of a political crisis, which was on the front page of the paper every day when we were down there. We said, this sounds like a really interesting story because it's about race, and we approached her. So that's how we got into that. But we continued to look for many other stories. And what we do is we figure, who do we know? Are the people interesting? Humor is a really big part of our film, so we wanted people where there was something going to be funny or quirky or sort of surprising about the stories. We didn't want to do. We used to tell people we don't want to do a CNN. It's not a CNN piece. It's really like looking for something else. So that's kind of the process, and we would go back every few months and catch up on our main characters, and there were a bunch of characters we followed who never made it into the final film. We had a whole section about the HBO series Treme, which was filming when we were down there, and none of that made it into the movie. It was good material, but it just didn't fit our schedule. And then, as Peter said, there's a lot of editing. So we stopped shooting a couple years ago and spent, the subsequent amount of time just editing, trying to make everything kind of work. And the other thing about this movie that's kind of important is that it has to work both for a national audience, which has no idea who Stacey Head is, never heard of her before they tuned in, and local people who know Stacey Head intimately from reading about her exploits day in and day out. So I had to work on both levels, and that's also a challenge that, it's a challenge we love to embrace, but it was a challenge.
It's interesting, what Louis said in terms of our contacts. I think that we were able to get stories that other filmmakers who would come down there wouldn't normally be able to find, because, as Louis said, Andy, Louis, and I lived there for a long time, and even though it's been decades since we've been there, we had a lot of street cred in terms of the fact that people had seen Andy and Louis' films. There were still people around that had done political stuff with people that I'd done politics with, and also our friends just knew different sorts of things. We were led to a lot of stories that didn't work. We had a whole story that we were following about a family that had been displaced over in St. Bernard Parish, to be able to show that the storm had affected not only African Americans but also white New Orleanians. We had a much larger section dealing with Make It Right and the Make It Right houses. But the whole editing process, and it's funny, guys, last night we had a really big crowd over at the New Orleans KLRU old Austin City Limits studio, and somebody asked about editing and how one edits, and the process is that it's not a democratic process. As you start to edit the stuff down, you've got to go with the stories that are the best stories and the characters that are the best characters, and then make them to be true metaphors for a larger story. So that we just had the advantage of, knowing people that knew a lot of stuff. Not all of it got into the film, not all of it was useful, but it really gave us a head start on doing what Andy so nicely said was the post-Katrina, film, something that didn't involve Katrina at all. And I think we lost most of that Katrina stuff. By the way, guys, there was a big contingent of New Orleanians there last night, white and black, and it was fabulous because they loved the film. Okay, they asked some really hard questions in terms of, how the media had not covered New Orleans correctly in their view, and they just loved it. It was just, it actually made me pretty teary just to listen to them and to talk to them afterwards.
Great.
That's amazing. And I know that POV we also hosted a premiere party as well that I didn't attend personally, but I know that went really well. And so our next question, and just as a reminder to anybody watching, please submit your questions, and we'll take them as soon as possible. So I have a question in terms of, as you were saying, finding your subjects. What recommendations, do you have for filmmakers who are following election? And then how did you cast your characters to ensure that it just wasn't a story of good versus bad guys in politics?
Well, we've done a bunch of election movies over the years, and election movies are very appealing on a very basic level because they come with a built-in storyline. There's a beginning, middle, and then there's an end because somebody wins or loses, and that's really very seductive if you're a documentary filmmaker trying to find a story. The problem with election movies is that there's always something going on in election. There's always events and people huddling and stuff going on, and you go crazy shooting all this stuff that ultimately may not make a lot of difference. You never know which handshaking thing or which coffee clutch is going to turn into something interesting, or it's just going to be like we've already done this 10 times. So that's always a challenge. But what we tried to do here is we didn't want to make a film specifically about an election. The election had to be a metaphor for a larger question about New Orleans and race, and that's essentially what we ended up with. And we were also gifted with a candidate who was reasonably open in letting us in, because that's the other challenge if you want to make a film about an election is, are you really going to get into anything? Because put yourself in the candidate's shoes, especially nowadays. Why would they let a camera in to anything like behind the scenes? It's not it's not a great idea, because who knows where it's going to happen or if they're going to run for office in the future and all that sort of thing. So these are all challenges. Election films are great. And then, of course, I'm going to just say one more thing about election films. They're great, but usually by the time it takes for you to edit it, the election is long past. and you have to decide whether is your audience going to know how it comes out. The advantage to shooting what for the rest of the country was a relatively obscure city council race in New Orleans was that people didn't know if Stacey Head was going to win or not, so they would sit and watch the movie. Now, people in New Orleans knew that she's not only won, but she's won 2 elections since. So they had a different thing going. They wanted to see, what are we going to see behind the scenes of the Stacey that we don't know? And that's what New Orleanians love about the movie. They get to see Stacey in kind of behind-the-scenes personal stuff, like with her mother. And they didn't know Stacey's mother was like that, so for them it's a big revelation. So you have to kind of figure out how it's all going to work.
Yeah, and I'm curious, during the production editing process, how did you guys play up the universal themes of the story to make sure that it wasn't relevant to just a New Orleans audience, but it would mean a lot to those living outside of New Orleans?
I think you're just trying to tell a story. I don't know if we break it down that way. I think we had a major challenge to tell any kind of a story. So that's really what we're up against. Because in this kind of film where there's just little fragments of all these things, trying to make the one scene lead to the next, and then it's kind of it's a very sort of intuitive and it's kind of like monkeys taping Shakespeare, because you don't really know. You try stuff, but you really have to cut it, and then you have to sit down and look at another 90-minute version where things have been juggled a little, and it can be hard because you lose your perspective, and it's that kind of challenge.
Yeah, you always have those problems with editing. I mean, it's very quick to lose perspective. The thing about making a movie. Making a movie about New Orleans, especially, or making a movie really about anything, you're going to have some people who are going to know a lot more about the subject than other people. So you have to kind of assume in your head a certain kind of a viewer when you're editing. And we have often sort of said, oh well, we're editing for X kind of person, and it's sort of like, well, yes, we don't care about the Manhattan liberals, or we're making a movie, we're making something for so just the average schmo out there, or whatever it is, and you kind of create this sort of person in your head, and then you bounce off that, your edit off that sort of idea, of what that person would perceive. In this case, okay. As Louis pointed out, we really have two major different audiences. You've got New Orleanians who know an awful lot about Stacey Head, who know an awful lot about their city. In fact, that's kind of what New Orleanians do most of the time, is they talk about their city and how wonderful it is and how much they love it. Okay, and then you've got the rest of the world out there, the great unwatched, right? Who kind of know something but don't really know a lot. Okay, and so you have to kind of balance that information. How much do people know? How much do people need to know in order to be able to follow this narrative? Okay, some of it's completely self-explanatory. Some of it's just like, oh, there's this character, there are these characters, and there are these relationships, and you kind of follow it, you follow it, and you follow it. But then there's a lot of other stuff. There's a lot of other stuff that might be kind of just sort of information which is perhaps only known to New Orleanians and that sort of thing, and you have to kind of balance that with, oh yeah, we had a joke in the movie which related to it was sort of like a concept that kept coming up in the city called the shadow government, and it was referring to just post-Katrina, that there was a thought of cabal who was taking over, was going to run the city, and it was businessmen, by and large, the same people who you would expect who would be part of such a cabal. Okay, and a lot of people bought that and they believed that. Okay, now that was something that we actually have in our movie, but it's in a version of the movie which we actually didn't broadcast because nationally, no one is going to really get that deeply embedded in that material. But in sort of a longer cut, a cut that we would show to sort of all different kinds of audiences, we included it because you know what? It's like it's in, and if you get it, you get it, and if you don't get it, you don't get it. But it's okay. It's kind of one of those things that the details that we love to revel in, okay, and that New Orleanians love to revel in. But by and large, you have to kind of shake it out. You've got to go, okay, well, who am I making this for?
Right, that's so important. And so we have a question from Dane Evans. He asks, with race being such a touchy subject in our country, how did you traverse this complicated issue with such honesty?
You know, it was funny last night. Actually, a few of the New Orleanians came up to me and they said, how the heck did you guys, you know, 4 white guys, do a film that's mostly African-American voices? And I think it's maybe hard for people to understand outside of New Orleans, but no matter how, you know, how visceral race is as an issue in New Orleans, whites, blacks, Creoles just talk to each other all the time. And it's different than any other place I've ever lived in terms of the ease, if you're comfortable, to be able to move within worlds. You know, in a lot of ways, black New Orleans and white New Orleans, you know, were very separate when we lived there. You know, but Andy, Louis, and I are filmmakers, you know, and we're also involved in a lot of cultural and political things in the city. And there's an ease there that I've never found as much in other cities, so that nobody thinks it's so weird, you know, to be able to be talking cross-racial on this sort of stuff. And the delight of making a film in New Orleans, as you see when you watch our film, is that people have absolutely no compulsion to not tell you what's on their minds. You know, when Barbara's, you know, talking about the Watson campaign, who they're hiring, she goes, "This is for the camera. He's hiring Mexicans." You know, or the guy that's cutting the meat over at the Poor Boy Festival, who goes, "Well, I think my mom's neighbors were Japanese. They might be Korean." You just don't hear that in other places. And I think that ease of transporting in between communities is just something that comes naturally. And we had done it so much in our careers. You know, Peter, I'd actually be curious what you thought about this. You know, as the interloper, the person going into this weird place called New Orleans, if you notice this as well. But there's an ease of being in New Orleans and filming that I just don't find in other places, or not as much. Put it that way.
Yeah, I think people, you know, told you what they thought pretty straightforwardly. You know, there's always some people who are more political than others, they're a little more self-conscious, but there were certainly lots of people who were very open about, especially race in terms of politics. You know, I think that's the easiest to talk about. I think, you know, because I think for decades how people voted and how people vote in New Orleans is connected to their race, and that's not a secret, and that's not something that people try to hide. You know, so I think it's a natural thing.
That's great. So can you tell me some of the biggest challenges of making the film? And that could be just in regards to the production process, the editing process. Was there anything that kind of like stood out to you that was more of a challenge than the other films that you've made in the past about New Orleans?
I'm just going to jump in and say quickly, just a little short thing. I think the hardest thing actually was not being there in the end. You know, being hundreds of miles away. It's a problem, I think, in making any documentary, that if you're there, it's a huge advantage. You can just pick up on stories, things happen, you read something, you bump into somebody. And I think when you're out of town, that makes it a lot harder. Would you agree? Or?
No, I think that's true. And, I mean, every film is a challenge in a different way. Films like Getting Back to Our Normal, where there were lots of characters and lots of stories, are always challenging because you have to decide how many roads you're going to go down, how far you're going to travel down each road. And you can just spend a lot of time going off on, you know, on what ultimately turn out to be tangents, but you don't know that. The thing I like about filmmaking is the serendipity of it all. And, for example, we met a character named Henry, this sort of old man who lives in the lower Ninth Ward, and we just kept running into him, so he kind of became a character. And then we said, well, Henry, we want to go out and have you give us tour your neighborhood, and you went, okay, you know. So sometimes you go to something you go to a shoot that's worthless in the immediate sense of bringing back footage, but you make contacts that turn out to be really useful for something else in the movie. And that's the serendipity, and that's why I think independents have this advantage over the CNNs of the world, because independents can just kind of go and hang out and spend time and sort of follow their nose and see what happens. It's not like, oh, you have 3 days to do this, and then you have to come out with a complete story. So. Yeah, and were there any surprises for you? Did you learn anything new about New Orleans through the process of getting back to normal that was new from the many other films that you've made about the city? Actually, the thing is, it's like New Orleans will always be New Orleans. I think that really is what's kind of after all that, and after being there, and after hearing everyone's Katrina story, and it's one of the reasons why we ended up with a quote from 1883, which talked about there's corruption, but I'd rather be here than own the entire state of Ohio. It's this compelling, wonderful, horrible place that once you get it into your bloodstream, for most folks, not everybody, but certainly for us, you just can't get it out of your system, and it will survive kind of no matter what. And that was really a lot of fun. But you can't say that it isn't changing. Okay, and that's kind of part of the thing. I think before the storm, we all had sort of the attitude that New Orleans would never change. It was a backwater, you know. It was a part of America which its authenticity was very strong. People never left. You know, it was kind of one of those places where you could leave for 10 years, come back, and people would say, "So how you doing? How's things going?" You know, they didn't even know you'd left. You know, it's so tried and true in its ways. You know, and that had built up over hundreds of years of tradition. Okay, not to say that things hadn't changed, but they just seem to change more slowly there than they do in other places. Okay, since the storm, we have to say, okay, that New Orleans, with all of that media attention, and even though it's not there in the same way now, but there was a tremendous amount. The spotlight was really on the city in a lot of different ways. Okay, and that cannot not change the way things are. Okay, and I think, you know, to some degree, if you have 80% of the city flooded, okay, it's going to create changes with enormous numbers of people leaving and a lot of them not coming back. Okay, having said that, okay, what people were always straining for and trying to do was to hang on to those things that made New Orleans unique: the food, the architecture, the people, the culture, the street culture. Okay, all of that. That the stuff that we love, the politics, okay, you know, the way in which you have to have colorful politicians. You can't just have plain old vanilla politicians. It's just not going to work here. Okay. Well, that's still the case. Okay, that's still the case. But I think now, and I think that's part of kind of the Stacey Head story, is that people now kind of want competent people running things. They want somebody. They desperately wanted some people to kind of step up who were not of the same mold, who in fact had the ability. Yes, there could be colorful. Of course, we still want entertainment in our public officials, but they got to know how to run things. Okay, on a very basic level, they've got to be competent. Okay, and I think that's kind of what Stacey brought to the store, as it were. And I think that, you know, and I think people have responded to that. She's been reelected twice with larger and larger margins in a citywide. So I think that kind of a yearning is very important. And I think those are the kinds of changes that you see, and I think they're positive changes. It also opens up new ideas, you know, new ways of looking at the world, new ways of solving your own problems, all that kind of stuff, which New Orleans really kind of, you know, had not really cotton to before the storm. Yeah, and so for anybody who's coming to New Orleans, you know, making a film about it, perhaps for the first time, what kind of recommendations do you guys have?
I think maybe we recommend they don't do it, because there's at this point there's you know, there's really kind of a, you know, there's been so much stuff done on New Orleans. Mm-hmm. You know, I think actually if they're going to do this, they ought to move there. You know, Peter's right. Not being there is probably one of the biggest challenges. Is one of the interesting things right now is that there's a new generation of filmmakers that are living in New Orleans who are doing topics that are not Katrina topics. You know, there's a wonderful film about James Booker, the late jazz pianist, Bahu Maharaji, that was just made a couple of years ago. A very nice film called Land of Opportunity, by Louis Alvarez, which has turned into a really, really valuable website for people to trade videos dealing with community action. And there's just a bunch of stuff going on there. All these filmmakers, which quite frankly in their 20s and early 30s remind me of us when we were living in New Orleans back then. You know, the guys are right. I mean, in some ways the city has changed a lot. You have to understand that, you know, I was just thinking that early on in this process, I was in New Orleans doing a guest teaching thing over at Tulane, and I literally called Andy, Louie, and Peter up because I was listening to talk radio saying this place has not changed at all. It's as dysfunctional as it's always been. But on the other hand, and this is part of the reason why I think you've got to, if you're going to do something about New Orleans, you got to be there, is the city has totally changed in terms of the national culture. When we lived down there, and we used to go to Jazz Fest, let's say in the 1970s or early 80s, I remember, you know, getting on my bicycle, going over there. It cost $10 to get in, and there were so few people there. I bumped into the mayor of New Orleans. I bumped the Dutch Morial there a bunch. You know, now there's like 120,000 people flying in from all over the world. You know, they can watch Treme, they can watch one of 7 billion documentaries, and movies are being produced there. It's not the backwater that it was back when we were there. So to a large extent, the culture hasn't changed, you know, but it's a place in the national consciousness has. And so if you want to do something that's different, if you want to do something about the new New Orleans or how New Orleans history, which is still fascinating for those people that don't know about it, you know, the best way to be able to do it is to be there, you know, because then you pick up on the nuances. And David Simon in an early cut said that New Orleans has nuances on its nuances, you know, and I think that's the stuff that if we had been there, we could have done even more than that. I think for the 14-hour version of this film. But I think that's the deal. You go there, you figure out those niches that are interesting unto themselves, you know, as an interesting subject, that they just happen to be in New Orleans. So, you know, young filmmakers, you want to make a film about New Orleans, just pick up there and move. It's a great place for you to live in Bywater or the Mary someplace.
Actually, my advice is always don't go to New Orleans, do your own town. You know, I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Okay, there's all sorts of untold stories to Milwaukee, and you're much more likely to find something interesting in a place that hasn't been, you know, chewed over by 10,000 other filmmakers.
And that you're familiar with, you know, that you know. I think that's a huge advantage.
Absolutely. And so we have about 10 more minutes left in this chat today. So before we go, please, if you're watching, submit your questions, and we'll get them asked before the chat is over. And I'd like just to get your advice, especially, I know, Paul, you help run the University of Texas Film Department. If you guys could all just give me perhaps like one piece of advice, you know, for an aspiring filmmaker, you know, whether it's specifically about, you know, New Orleans or about, you know, working and collaborating together with other filmmakers over a long period of time.
I think if I was going to give it, you know, one piece of advice, I actually, again, I'd go towards what Louis and Peter were just saying. Film something that you really care about, something that you know about, okay, and understand how to collaborate early. Okay, you know, auteur theory is interesting, okay, but it doesn't exist in documentary filmmaking. You know, essentially, you know, you have to depend on the kindness of strangers or the kindness of friends. And so can you work with other people and then do something you know about? I mean, the difference between a good film and a great film is a good film has good stories, it's filmed well, it's in focus, hopefully. A great film has all that stuff, but it makes you think about something broader. You know, it makes you think about the larger issues. I hope if people watch our film, they not only think about these particularly fabulous characters, but they understand a little bit more about what New Orleans actually means and the place and possibilities of race. You know, so know something that you want to do, because you don't go into this to become rich. You don't go into this to become famous. You go into this to make something you're really proud of and something you express to a larger public.
That's great. So, Louis, Andy, or Peter, would you like to add?
No, I think Paul really.
You got to follow your heart. I think. I mean, especially these days. I think where.
You know, I think you know, when you look at documentaries today, okay, that's the other thing, is that more and more and more people are making them. You know, I mean, and younger people are making them, and it's all about access to equipment and that sort of thing, and everything. You know, everyone has you have a smartphone, you have a camera. You know, and it shoots 1080p. You know, I mean, it's quite remarkable, and people. So that part of the equation, which when we began making films, was a big deal. Okay, I mean, it was much harder, you know, to get to the equipment you needed to make a movie. That part's gone. That's off the table. So anyone can now be a documentary filmmaker. It doesn't mean you're going to be a good documentary filmmaker. It just means you can be one if you want. And so you see, and that's of course what's in fact been happening. You know, there's lots and lots and lots of movies being made. Are some of them good? Some of them are good. Are a lot of them not good? A lot of them are not good. It's kind of what you would expect. Okay. On the other hand, the ones that seem to stick out are the ones which not only have sort of unique subjects, but one in which people have a real understanding of what they're filming. And I think that's what everybody's been going for here, is that, you know, when you film what you know, it's because you have that kind of intimate relationship with the environment, the people, or whatever it is, and what is the story, whatever that is, and you can approach, you know, a good documentary in any number of different ways. Okay, but it's that sort of fundamental relationship, you know, is what ultimately will kind of make something good or make something great.
That's great. And Peter, was there something you wanted to add?
No, I think you know, you're also developing, a trust with the characters in your film, and when you're interviewing them, the closer you can get to having that conversation be like a conversation with a friend, I think, where it has that kind of, you know, you just had a cup of coffee with someone, and for the first time they're revealing something to you, or they're to capture that feeling on film, which is not an easy thing, as part of the goal, and I think that's why familiarity with the people or the place or the subject is important, especially in this kind of cultural type film, as opposed to a, you know, investigative report about, you know, massacres or something. You know, so there are different ways and there are different subjects, and they require different ideas.
That's
Knowing what
great.
you're doing always helps.
So we're going to wrap up the chat now. I'd just like to add in a comment from Michael Goodwin that says, you know, I heard this documentary, but I had no idea that you were involved until I saw the credits. It's just like your earlier films, brilliant, crazy, complicated, inspiring, and thoughtful. Congratulations, old friends. Mike Goodwin.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
So just give me one quick second. So what are your plans for the future? What do you guys have brewing right now?
Paul, Peter, you want to start first?
You know, like we've been cooking up something to do with Texas politics, but as Andy said, access is getting harder and harder with political campaigns. So it's completely possible that either we'll do something with this project, or I might take a rest and then do something completely different. I had a long talk with a paleontologist friend last night about evolution and how a different way of dealing with evolution so it's not so political. And I used to like dinosaurs a lot when I was a kid, so maybe it's time to get into science films.
Dinosaur running for office in Texas.
Oh, Peter.
I'm working on something that's called right now Old Friends, and it's about, that's a part of where I was coming from, I think. It's about talking to my friends who are both friends of mine for a long time, and they're old. And it's about aging, it's about mortality, it's about relationships, it's about where I came from and how I got here. So, I know it's a very personal film. It's kind of the opposite.
That's good.
Andy and I are working on a film about how the food supply, it's called The Miracle of Feeding Cities, about how food gets to our table. It's kind of an amazing sort of story about people and technology. We're working on a follow-up to our film from 15 years ago called People Like Us, which is about inequality and class in America. And we got a couple other things cooking. We got a really great, fun web series we're doing called Buckwheat's World, which features Buckwheat Zydeco, who's the legendary Louisiana musician, just kind of hanging out, making amazing music. It's really fun to be working every day with his music.
That's great. And I didn't catch, are any of these going to be based in New Orleans?
Well, Buckwheat Zydeco is a Louisiana.
Close.
We can't stay away from Louisiana, but
It's Southwest
yeah,
Louisiana.
but very
It's
different.
not- it's not New Orleans.
The countryside. Now, New Orleans, we're going to take a break from New Orleans for a while. Stuff to go visit.
That's great. So it actually looks like we have time just for one more question, perhaps. So, I'm curious as well. How did you establish trust, with your subjects at first? When you first met Head and Lacing Color, because I'm sure there was also a lot of nervousness around their election as well. Can you guys speak to that, and making your subjects feel comfortable?
Well, this is part of when you have made a lot of films before.
Yeah.
You have work to show them, and you can basically say this is what we do. 20 years ago we made a film called Vote for Me, and the main section of that film dealt with a non-professional politician named Maggie Lauderer who ran for Congress. She had been an NPR personality in Asheville, North Carolina, and she ran for Congress and kind of got a real education in the rough and tumble of politics. And so we said to Stacy, look at the way she was treated. Look at her story, and I think you'll see we are fair, we are balanced, we don't have an agenda, other than to kind of tell the story in the New Orleans way. And so we sent her a whole bunch of tapes, and she looked at some of Paul's as well, and she took a chance to do it. And she has said subsequently that, what was I thinking exactly? But it was part of her education. I think it's toughened her up. She has gone on the record saying that she believes it's been a fair portrayal of her, which we of course wanted it to be, and we salute her. We salute her courage in allowing the cameras in. Barbara, on the other hand, would have been with us 24/7. She was extremely happy to be filmed. What you see with Barbara is what you get. And as you see from for those of you who saw the film, there's kind of a climax scene where she kind of lets her hair down and cries and really shows a really emotional side for her, which I think was very important for her. It's obviously important for us as filmmakers telling the story, but I think what happens when you get close to somebody, when you get close to your subject, you actually become a little bit of a therapist. And people get an emotional connection, and they feel they can trust you, and you get these extraordinary moments. And I think it's one of the reasons that Andy and I certainly make films is when you get to those moments, there's just nothing. There's nothing like it. It's really wonderful. You feel incredibly bonded to your subject, and once that's happened, you really don't want to screw them over in the final cut, because the filmmaker can be God, and they can make anybody look like a fool if we wanted to, and we don't play that kind of a game. But it's trust is really, really important.
That's great.
The only thing I would add is that I think that's kind of the prime directive of any documentary filmmaker is creating trust with whoever it is you're filming, and however you have to do it, whatever it takes, is really kind of what you have to do. And we sometimes give little lessons in how to do interviewing, and one of the ways in which we try to get people to be comfortable with us is to pretend that we're considerably less knowledgeable about what's going on than we actually are. So in other words, you kind of play dumb. And we can say some of the dumbest questions have come out of our mouths. Because in fact, it's a way of kind of making people understand that, oh yeah, well, I'm not dealing with somebody who is trying to steal my soul here. Okay, that there's this kind of they really want to understand that. Really, they don't understand that. That's so basic. What's okay. Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you what this is about. So that whatever it takes. Okay, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it's hanging out with them for what appears to be inordinately long periods of time, because you know that there's something there. You want to get to it, and you know how important it is, and you know that ultimately that story needs to be told, and so but in fact it's whatever the process requires, sort of, is ultimately what we do.
It's an interesting thing that I think it's also who we are. I mean, I remember we went into interview Mario Cuomo for Vote for Me 20 years ago, and he took one look at us and was going, just who let these guys in? You know, basically because we're very informal. We don't go there with shirts and ties. We don't go there with a ton of lights. And what's that?
We do wear shirts.
We do wear shirts, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but just we're very informal, and we're chatty, and it's a conversation. And what happens is a combination of understanding that there is no wrong in the interview. I mean, if somebody's boring, that's terrible. But you know, there are a lot of things that are in this film that were not the gems that we thought other parts of the interviews were. I mean, I remember, you know, doing Buddy Lemon, you know, and thinking that we hardly got anything. And there's two amazing quotes in there. The whole thing about New York, where everybody thinks it's the end of the universe every day to get stuff done, and dancing naked in the street. I don't even remember those when we did the interview. You know, but it's also a combination of really, really listening. So how can you be informal and listen at the same time? I was talking about this last night, guys. Actually, I talked a lot about us in New Orleans and the stuff we've done in the past. But there's a section in the film when Louis is talking to Maud Smith, and all of us had heard every single person who had lived in the St. Bernard Project, even though they wanted to go back to what it had been, had lost a family member. At least one person killed. It was astounding. And we had talked about this, about how do we, you know, present this in a film. And Louis talking to Maud Smith, you know, the person that's living in the New Columbia Park Project, and at the exact right moment, he says, "Did the violence ever touch you?" Okay, it's the exact way to be able to say it. It's simple. It came in the right moment. And she just looks in the camera, or she looks off in the distance and goes, "Yeah, I lost a son and three nephews and a son." And I got to tell you, you get that because of luck, serendipity, but also skill and understanding how to deal with people. You know, and you know, it's what makes this entire process an amazing thing to be as a filmmaker. If somehow, in some lucky way, you're able to figure out how to do this.
Well, thank you so much for all this incredible advice that you guys have given today and your time and chatting. And so for everybody who's watching, the full film will be free online until August 12th. And then you can also go to the POV companion page to watch an extended interview with the filmmakers as well. You can read Paul Stekler's History of Documentary Film in New Orleans, and then a searchable list of essential documentaries about New Orleans. Just download a discussion guide and many more. So once again, thank you for your time today, and we'll see you online. And please feel free to carry on the conversation with our hashtag Getting Back to Normal. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye.